The pillbox erupted in a geyser of fire and smoke, and somewhere inside that concrete tomb, men were dying because of what I held in my trembling hands. I was 20 years old, standing on a volcanic island 8,000 miles from the Kentucky hills where I'd been born, and in that moment I understood that war transforms ordinary men into instruments of both salvation and destruction. The flamethrower strapped to my back weighed 70 pounds, but the weight of what I was doing pressed down on my soul with a force that no scale could ever measure. Behind me, 2 Marines lay motionless in the black sand, their lives traded for mine in a transaction I had never agreed to make. This is the story of how a farm boy who was told he was too short to serve became the man who broke through an enemy line that had stopped an entire division cold. But I am getting ahead of myself, racing toward that terrible day on the island when everything changed forever. To understand what happened in those 4 hours of flame and death, you must first know the boy who walked into a recruiting office with nothing but determination and a burning desire to protect the country that had given his family everything. You must understand the journey that took him from the green valleys of Appalachia to the ash-covered beaches of a Pacific hell. You must feel the weight of responsibility that settled onto his young shoulders when he realized that the lives of his fellow Marines depended on whether he could find the courage to stand up when every instinct screamed at him to stay down. This is that story, told as truthfully as memory allows. I was born in the autumn of 1923 in a hollow called Willow Creek, nestled in the mountains of eastern Kentucky where the morning mist clung to the ridges like cotton caught on barbed wire. My father worked the coal mines until the black lung took him when I was just 12 years old, leaving my mother alone with 4 children and a hard-scrabble farm that barely produced enough to keep us fed. We grew tobacco and corn, raised chickens and a few hogs, and learned early that survival in those hills required a stubborn determination that city folks could never understand. My older brothers handled most of the heavy work while I tended to the smaller chores, always aware that my slight frame made me less useful than I wanted to be. I was the runt of the family, and I carried that knowledge like a stone in my pocket throughout my childhood. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, I was working in the tobacco barn, stripping leaves and hanging them to cure in the cold December air. My mother came running from the house with tears streaming down her weathered face, and I knew before she spoke that something terrible had happened somewhere far beyond our mountain hollow. She told me about the bombs, about the ships burning in the harbor, about the president's voice on the radio declaring that we were now at war with an enemy most Americans could not even locate on a map. I felt something shift inside me that day, a stirring of purpose that would not let me rest until I had done my part to answer the attack. I was only 17 years old, but I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to fight. The following spring, I walked 12 miles to the nearest town and presented myself at the Marine Corps recruiting station with my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The recruiter was a gunnery sergeant with ribbons on his chest and eyes that had seen things I could only imagine, and he looked me up and down with obvious skepticism before even glancing at my paperwork. He measured my height against the marks on the wall and shook his head slowly. 5'5", he announced to no one in particular. Son, the Marine Corps requires men to be at least 5'8" tall. You don't meet the standard. I tried to argue, tried to explain that my size had nothing to do with my courage or my willingness to fight, but he had already turned away to help the next applicant. I returned to the farm with my hopes crushed and my pride wounded in ways that only a young man rejected by his country can understand. My 2 older brothers had already been drafted into the army, and I watched them leave in their olive drab uniforms with a mixture of envy and frustration that gnawed at my insides. I did not want to wear the Army uniform. I wanted to be a Marine, to wear the dress blues I had seen in the recruiting posters, to become part of the legendary fighting force that had earned glory at Belleau Wood and in the jungles of Nicaragua. So I waited, working the farm with my mother, praying every night that something would change and give me the chance I so desperately needed. I had no way of knowing that my prayers would soon be answered. In early 1943, the Marine Corps lowered its height requirement to meet the demands of a war that was consuming young men faster than the nation could produce them. The same recruiter who had rejected me drove his government car up our dirt road and found me splitting firewood behind the barn, my shirt soaked with sweat despite the February chill. He asked if I still wanted to enlist, and I dropped that axe so fast it nearly took off my foot on the way down. Within a week, I was on a train headed to boot camp in South Carolina, watching the mountains of my home disappear behind me and wondering if I would ever see them again. I was finally going to be a Marine, and nothing else in the world mattered. Boot camp was a revelation that stripped away everything I thought I knew about myself and rebuilt me into something harder and more capable than I had ever imagined possible. The drill instructors seemed to take particular pleasure in testing the limits of the smaller recruits, but I discovered that my years of farm work had given me a wiry strength that surprised even the most skeptical sergeants. I could march longer, dig faster, and endure more than men who stood a full head taller than me, and gradually I earned a grudging respect from my fellow recruits. We trained with rifles and bayonets, learned to throw grenades and set demolitions, and slowly transformed from a collection of scared young men into something resembling a fighting unit. By the time I completed advanced infantry training, I had been selected for a specialty that would define the rest of my life. They chose me for flamethrower training because my small stature made me a smaller target and because I had demonstrated an unusual ability to remain calm under pressure during live fire exercises. The weapon itself was a terrifying apparatus that strapped to your back like a monstrous metal parasite, containing 2 tanks of thickened fuel and 1 tank of compressed nitrogen that propelled the burning mixture up to 50 yards with devastating effect. We practiced on mock bunkers constructed of wood and sandbags, learning to approach from angles that minimized our exposure while maximizing the effectiveness of our flame. The instructors taught us that the flamethrower was not merely a weapon but a psychological tool that could break enemy morale and force defenders to abandon positions they would otherwise hold to the death. What they did not teach us was how to live with the knowledge of what that flame would do to human flesh. I was assigned to the 28th Marine Regiment, which was itself part of the 5th Marine Division being assembled for operations in the Pacific Theater. We shipped out from San Diego in the winter of 1945 aboard a transport ship so crowded that we slept in shifts and ate our meals standing up because there were not enough seats in the mess hall. The voyage across the Pacific took nearly a month, during which we trained on deck, cleaned our weapons obsessively, and speculated endlessly about where we were being sent. The rumors ranged from the Philippines to Formosa to Japan itself, but the truth remained a closely guarded secret known only to the highest-ranking officers. We would not learn our destination until we were already at sea and too far from land to turn back. The briefing came on a gray morning when the ship's captain summoned all hands to the main deck and unveiled a large board showing the outline of a small island shaped roughly like a pork chop. The island was called Iwo Jima, a volcanic speck in the vast Pacific that most of us had never heard of, but which the officers assured us was of vital strategic importance. Intelligence reports suggested that the island was defended by approximately 8,000 Japanese soldiers and that the campaign would last no more than 5 days, after which we would be withdrawn to prepare for the eventual invasion of Japan itself. Our division was designated as the reserve force, which meant We would probably never leave the ship unless the assault troops encountered unexpected resistance. Looking back now, I marvel at how wrong those estimates would prove to be. We arrived off the coast of Iwo Jima on the 19th of February, 1945, and anchored several miles offshore to watch the initial assault waves hit the beaches. From our vantage point on the deck, we could see the island clearly, a barren expanse of volcanic rock and black sand, dominated by a mountain at its southern tip that rose 500 feet above the sea. The naval bombardment had been going on for days, and we assumed that nothing could have survived such a concentrated display of firepower. The first waves of Marines hit the beach at 9 o'clock in the morning, and for a few minutes it seemed like the intelligence reports might be accurate after all. Then the Japanese opened fire from positions we had not even known existed, and the beaches became a killing ground. By nightfall of the first day, the casualty reports filtering back to our ship painted a picture of chaos and slaughter that exceeded anything the planners had anticipated. The enemy had constructed an elaborate network of tunnels, bunkers, and fortified pillboxes that connected the entire island into a single defensive position of almost impenetrable strength. There were not 8,000 defenders, but more than 20,000, and they were dug in so deeply that the naval bombardment had barely scratched them. We received orders that night to prepare for landing the following morning, and I spent those dark hours cleaning my flamethrower and trying not to think about what awaited us on those black sand beaches. Sleep was impossible, so I wrote a letter to my mother and another to the girl back home who had promised to wait for me. We loaded into the landing craft at dawn on the 20th of February, descending the cargo nets with our heavy equipment and cramming ourselves into the Higgins boats that would carry us to shore. The boats circled offshore all day long, waiting for a signal to land that never came because there was simply no room on the beaches for additional troops. Bodies and destroyed equipment clogged the landing zones, and the Marines who had survived the first day were pinned down under withering fire with nowhere to advance. We returned to the ship that night frustrated and terrified in equal measure, knowing that our turn would come and dreading what we would find. The next morning, we went in for real. The ramp of the Higgins boat dropped into knee-deep water, and I stepped off into a landscape that resembled nothing so much as a vision of hell rendered in volcanic ash and human suffering. Destroyed vehicles littered the beach in twisted heaps of burning metal, their crews still visible inside, some of them in attitudes of frozen agony. The black sand sucked at my boots with every step, making forward progress feel like wading through molasses while bullets cracked overhead and mortar rounds sent geysers of ash into the smoke-filled sky. But the sight that burned itself into my memory forever was the row of Marine bodies wrapped in their ponchos and stacked along the tide line like cordwood, waiting for evacuation that might never come. I had known that war meant death, but nothing had prepared me for the industrial scale of the killing I witnessed in those first terrible minutes on Iwo Jima. We fought our way off the beach and across the first airfield, crawling more than walking, taking cover behind every depression and destroyed vehicle we could find. The Japanese were invisible, firing from positions so well concealed that we often could not tell where the bullets were coming from until another Marine fell beside us. By the third day, I had lost all 6 of the flamethrower operators who had been assigned to my company, either killed or wounded or simply vanished into the chaos of the battle. I found myself the only man left in Charlie Company who knew how to operate the weapon that might be our only hope of breaking through the enemy fortifications. My commanding officer, a captain named Morrison, who would later receive a battlefield promotion to major, summoned all available non-commissioned officers to a meeting in a shell crater near the front lines. I was technically only a corporal and therefore not required to attend, but my first sergeant grabbed me by the arm and told me the captain wanted me present. We gathered in that crater while mortar rounds burst around us and machine gun fire crackled overhead, and Captain Morrison explained the situation in terms that left no room for optimism. A string of reinforced concrete pillboxes blocked our advance toward the center of the island, and every attempt to assault them had resulted in devastating casualties without meaningful progress. The enemy positions were mutually supporting, meaning that attacking one pillbox exposed our men to fire from several others, and we had lost nearly 100 Marines trying to break through in the past 2 days. The captain looked at me with eyes that held both desperation and hope, and asked if I thought I could do anything with my flamethrower against those fortifications. I do not remember exactly what I said in response, but other Marines who survived that day told me later that I simply nodded and said I would try. The captain assigned 4 riflemen to provide covering fire while I approached the pillboxes, and I selected 1 additional Marine to follow me with pole charges that could be inserted into the apertures after I had neutralized them with flame. We studied the terrain as best we could from the lip of the crater, identifying the positions we would need to attack and the routes that offered the best chance of survival. Then I strapped on my flamethrower, checked my fuel lines one final time, and climbed out of that crater into the most terrifying 4 hours of my life. I had no idea that what I was about to do would change everything. The first pillbox was perhaps 80 yards away across open ground that offered almost no cover from the interlocking fields of fire the Japanese had established. I ran in short bursts, hitting the deck every few seconds, while my covering fire team poured rounds at every aperture they could see. Bullets kicked up spurts of ash all around me, so close that I could feel the heat of their passage, but somehow none of them found their mark. I reached a slight depression about 30 yards from the pillbox and caught my breath, studying the concrete structure for any weakness I could exploit. The aperture was a narrow horizontal slit, about 18 inches high and 4 feet wide, positioned to sweep the entire approach with machine gun fire. I would have to get within 20 feet to ensure my flame reached inside. I made my final approach in a desperate sprint that felt like it lasted forever, my finger already on the trigger as I closed the distance between myself and that concrete tomb. At 15 feet, I squeezed the igniter and felt the weapon buck against my body as a stream of liquid fire arced through the air and poured through the aperture like water through a drain. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, a roaring rush of combustion mixed with screams that I tried not to hear and have never been able to forget. I held the trigger for perhaps 5 seconds, then rolled away as my pole charge man ran forward to finish the job with explosives. The pillbox erupted in a secondary explosion that sent chunks of concrete flying through the air, and I knew that the men inside were dead. There was no time to think about what I had just done, no opportunity to process the magnitude of taking human lives in such a terrible fashion. The second pillbox was already firing at my position, and my covering team had taken casualties that reduced our protective fire by half. I crawled through the ash toward the next target, my fuel tanks growing lighter with each burst but still holding enough to complete my mission. The pattern repeated itself 6 more times over the next 3.5 hours. Sprint, crawl, ignite, roll away, move to the next target. By the time I had neutralized the 7th pillbox, my fuel was exhausted, and 2 of my 4 covering Marines lay dead in the volcanic ash, their lives sacrificed to protect mine. The breakthrough we achieved that day opened a lane through the enemy defenses that allowed our entire regiment to advance for the first time in nearly a week. Captain Morrison told me later that by eliminating those 7 pillboxes, I had saved countless lives that would have been lost in futile frontal assaults. I did not feel like a hero in that moment. I felt like a man who had done something terrible in service of something necessary. The faces of the two Marines who died protecting me haunted my dreams for years afterward, young men whose names I never learned but whose sacrifice I carry with me still. The battle for Iwo Jima continued for another month after that day, and I survived it all through a combination of luck and stubborn refusal to believe that I would not make it home. Nearly 7,000 Marines died on that island, and another 20,000 were wounded in fighting so brutal that it defies description. When they finally raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, I was 1,000 yards up the beach, digging a foxhole and trying to stay alive long enough to see the end. I watched that flag unfurl in the wind and felt something stir in my chest that might have been pride or grief for all the men who would never see their homes again. President Truman presented me with the Medal of Honor at a ceremony in Washington that October, draping the pale blue ribbon around my neck while flashbulbs popped and dignitaries applauded. I stood there in my dress uniform, feeling like an imposter, wondering why I had been chosen when so many Marines who had fought beside me had received nothing but early graves. The medal itself was beautiful, a 5-pointed bronze star hanging from a ribbon the color of a summer sky, but its weight seemed far heavier than the few ounces of metal it actually contained. I thought of the two Marines who had died protecting me, and I wondered if their families would ever understand that their sacrifice had made my survival possible. The decades since have given me time to reflect on what I did and what it cost, both to the enemy and to myself. I returned to Kentucky after the war, married the girl who had waited for me, raised a family, and built a life that bore little resemblance to those terrible days on Iwo Jima. But the memories never faded, and the faces of the dead visited me in dreams that left me sweating and shaking. I learned to live with what I had done, to accept that war sometimes requires ordinary men to do extraordinary and terrible things in defense of the values they hold dear. I am 99 years old now, and my remaining time grows short. The generation that fought that war is almost gone, and soon there will be no one left who remembers what it felt like to stand on those black sand beaches. But before we pass into history, I want the generations that follow to understand what we were fighting for and why it mattered. Freedom is not free, and the price has been paid in blood by young men and women who believe that some things are worth more than their own lives. The two Marines who died protecting me understood that truth, and I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of their sacrifice. Remember them